In the winter of 1285, the most feared army on earth descended once again upon the plains of the Hungarian kingdom. The Tumans of the Golden Horde crossed the passes of the Carpathians like a black and silent storm. Thousands of banners rippling above the most brutal cold that Central Europe had known in years. Their leaders, Nogai Khan and Tulabuga, marched with the absolute certainty of men who had never been stopped. 44 years earlier, the fathers and grandfathers of those warriors had turned Hungary into ash and bone. They had killed a quarter of its population. They had razed hundreds of villages, and they had departed without anyone being able to stand against them. Now the horde was returning, and in their minds only one question existed. How long would it take to repeat the victory? What they did not know was that the kingdom they had destroyed in 1241 no longer existed. In its place stood something different, something that the veterans of the first invasion would not have recognized. On every prominent hill, above every strategic pass, above every vital crossroads, stone towers now rose. Not the wooden palisades that had crumbled before the Mongol rams 4 decades earlier, not the earthen walls that had dissolved before their siege engines. Stone, cut stone and stacked stone, stone that no winter storm could bend. And in the eastern passes of the kingdom, in the foothills of the Carpathians, in the narrow valleys where the wind piled snow until the paths disappeared entirely, the Sekeli were waiting. Frontier warriors, mountain archers, men who had been born in those heights and who knew every rock, every cave, every bend where a handful of riders could control an entire gorge. They had been in position for weeks. No fires, no sound. With the absolute patience of those who know exactly what is coming and have decided to receive it entirely on their own terms. And when Tulabuga ordered the retreat and his men, starving and decimated by weeks of campaign in the worst winter in living memory, attempted to cross back through the same Carpathian passes through which they had entered, the world they knew shattered into pieces. Arrows from the ridgelines, horses falling onto snow, turning red beneath them, screams in Mongolian bouncing between rock walls without finding any answer. Men who had crossed Asia from end to end toppled from their mounts without knowing from where the blows were coming. The passes became traps, the cold became an enemy that never rested, and those who managed to keep moving found no relief. Only more hunger, only more arrows, only more mountain. When the last column of the horde abandoned Hungarian soil in the spring of 1286, all of Europe watched, without being entirely able to believe what had occurred. The Golden Horde, the scourge of peoples from the steppes of Asia to the heart of Poland, had collided with a kingdom it had already conquered once and had been turned back. Not with the help of any outside power, not with a crusade organized from Rome, but with stone walls, mountain archers, militias of local barons, and a winter that seemed to have taken the side of the defenders. And the echo of that defeat would resound across the steppes for decades. To understand the winter of 1285, one must understand what the winter of 1241 had left behind. The first Mongol invasion of Hungary had been one of the greatest catastrophes the European continent had experienced since the fall of the Roman Empire. Under the command of the brilliant strategist Subutai and Prince Batu Khan, the Mongol Tumans had crossed the Carpathians in several simultaneous columns and had crushed the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi on the banks of the Sajo River in April of 1241. King Bela III had fled desperately to Dalmatia, pursued closely by the cavalry of Kadan. The Hungarian army had been destroyed in the field, and for more than a year, Mongol horsemen had ridden unopposed across the plains of the kingdom, burning, looting, and massacring entire populations. Chronicles of the era estimated that roughly 1/4 of the kingdom's population perished. Cities and villages were reduced to rubble and ash. The chronicler Roger of Torremaggiore, who survived hidden in the forests, described a landscape of bones and ruins that stretched as far as the eye could see. But the Mongols left, not because they were defeated on the battlefield, but because of internal political reasons related to the succession of the Great Khan in Asia. And when Ladislaus IV returned from his Dalmatian exile, he did so carrying something that a humiliated king might not have been expected to preserve: determination. Ladislaus IV spent the remainder of his reign rebuilding his kingdom from its foundations. He understood with brutal clarity what had failed in 1241. The defenses of Hungary had been of wood and earth, and they had burned like straw before the invaders. The army had depended too heavily on light cavalry, ineffective against the steppe horse archers, and the kingdom lacked the density of fortifications necessary to slow an invasion that advanced at dizzying speed. Bela began to change all of this with a methodical obsession. He granted the nobility the right to build stone castles on their own lands, breaking with centuries of royal monopoly over fortresses. He built 44 new castles in the first 10 years after the invasion. He reformed the army, increasing the proportion of heavy cavalry and armored knights in the Western style. And he strengthened his alliances with the frontier peoples who knew the mountains better than anyone. In particular, the Szekely of Transylvania, warriors of extraordinary skill who had spent generations guarding the eastern passes of the kingdom. When Bela died and the throne passed, after several brief reigns, to his grandson Ladislaus IV in the year 1272, the Kingdom of Hungary was an entirely different place from the one the Mongols had devastated 3 decades before. The network of stone castles covered the strategic passes. Local garrisons knew their territory like the backs of their hands. And the collective memory of the first invasion acted as the most powerful of all spurs, the kind of memory that does not fade even across an entire generation. Meanwhile, on the eastern steppes, the Golden Horde remained the dominant power of Eurasia. The Khan who nominally ruled in the 1880s of the 13th century was Tulabuga, a man of weak character and mystical tendencies who had ceded real military control to the most dangerous man in his court, Nogai Khan, the Beklarbek, the de facto commander-in-chief, the power in the shadows behind the throne. And alongside Nogai operated Tulabuga, a young and ambitious prince who gazed westward with eyes full of hunger for glory. Nogai Khan was a man who carried the scars of decades of campaign on every inch of his body. It was said that he had lost an eye in some distant battle, and that the empty dark socket terrified his enemies even before he drew any weapon. He was a grandson of Yochi, the eldest son of Genghis Khan, and carried in his veins the conviction that the world was, by right, a Mongol inheritance that had simply not yet been fully collected. In the decades before 1285, Nogai had built a power so vast that historians would debate for centuries whether he was the general of a Khan or, in fact, the true ruler of the western half of the Mongol Empire. He governed directly over the peoples of Galicia and Volhynia. He had attacked Lithuania. He had sent thousands of soldiers to Constantinople. He had given his daughters in marriage to the Tsar of Bulgaria and to the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaeologus. His network of influence was a continental web that stretched from the shores of the Black Sea to the borders of Poland. He was the man who had planned the invasion of Hungary in 1285, and he had done so with the cold confidence of one who had not known defeat in a very long time. But the information he held about Hungary was flawed in a way that would prove fatal. The Cuman warriors, who had been expelled from Hungary in 1282, following a rebellion crushed by King Ladislaus IV, had arrived at Nogai's tents with stories of a kingdom torn apart by internal conflict. A king who had abandoned his Christian wife to live among Cuman concubines on the plains. A king who had imprisoned a papal legate. A king whose authority over his nobles was so weak that the barons operated almost as independent lords. To Nogai, all of this sounded like a perfect opportunity. A kingdom already known, already defeated in the past, now politically divided and apparently easy to subdue. The memory of Mohi, of the Hungarian armies fleeing the Sajo River, shone in his mind like a promise of what would happen again. What the fugitive Cumans had not told him, or perhaps had not themselves come to understand, was that the very decentralization that made the king weak made his barons extraordinarily strong. In a kingdom where the nobility had built their own castles, trained their own armies, and developed their own defensive tactics over decades, the weakness of central power did not mean defenselessness. It meant there would be dozens of local resistances, each perfectly adapted to its own terrain, each willing to fight without needing to wait for orders from anyone. Tulabuga was a different creature from Nogai, where the veteran Beklabek operated with the glacial calm of experience. The young prince burned with the impatience of one who wants to prove his worth in the lifetime of someone who has already proven everything. Tulabuga saw the invasion of Hungary as his great opportunity, his definitive demonstration that he deserved to lead the horde by his own strength and not in the shadow of a one-eyed old man. The campaign was as much his initiative as Nogai's, though both exercised command of separate columns. Nogai to the south, penetrating through Transylvania, Tulabuga to the north, crossing the Carpathians through Transcarpathia and advancing toward the heart of the Hungarian kingdom. On the Hungarian side, the picture was more complex than any spy of the horde could have fully grasped. Ladislaus IV, King of Hungary, was a man of deep contradictions. Known as Ladislaus the Cuman, raised under the influence of his step-blooded mother, he was in some sense a stranger at his own Christian court. He had imprisoned his wife, Queen Elizabeth of Anjou. He had abandoned the protocols of the court to live among the Cumans of the plains, surrounded by women of the steppes and sleeping in tents while his bishops struck him with anathemas. Archbishop Lodimir of Esztergom had gone so far as to declare a crusade against the Hungarian king himself. He was, in sum, a king whom his own nobles barely obeyed and whose religious legitimacy was permanently in question. And yet, when the invasion came, Ladislaus IV was able to gather an army, not the army he would have wished for, not with the discipline that a more respected king might have achieved, but enough, with heavy cavalry reformed in the Western style, with Cumans who served beneath his banners, with Saxon miners repurposed as emergency soldiers, an army of perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 men, according to the most cautious estimates of modern historians, which gathered slowly on the western bank of the Danube while the Mongols advanced from the east. But the real weight of the defense was not going to fall on the king. It was going to fall on men like Roland Borsa, the voivode of Transylvania, like Amadeus Aba and his kinsman George Baxa, like Peter of Saros, men of the provinces, local barons who knew every river, every pass, every village of their territories. And above all, it was going to fall on the Zekeli, the warrior people of Hungary's eastern frontiers, the horse archers who had lived for generations preparing for precisely this moment. The first signs arrived in the final months of 1284. Merchants crossing from Galicia and Volhynia returned with troubling news. The Tumans of the horde were moving. The vassal Russian princes had received orders to join the campaign. As was customary in the great expeditions, the dukes of the subjugated regions had been summoned. Something of great magnitude was being organized on the eastern steppes. In Hungary, the news arrived with the cold, and the cold of that winter was extraordinary even by Carpathian standards. The autumn rains had been torrential, causing rivers to overflow and turning the eastern plains into vast marshes of frozen mud. Then came the snow. Not the soft and manageable snow of Central Europe's normal winter, but the brutal snow of the great steppe winters, driven westward in gusts that made it impossible to see more than a few steps ahead. Roads vanished. Rivers changed course. Border villages were covered in white silence, as if the earth itself were hiding. Into this extraordinary winter, the horde began its advance. The Galician-Volhynian Chronicles, written by witnesses who accompanied the Russian princes on the campaign, describe what came next with a detail that makes the reader shudder. The rains and snow had caused rivers to overflow, turning the terrain into vast marshes. The Mongol army began losing men before they even set foot on Hungarian soil, horses sinking in the mud, supplies lost in crossing the flooded rivers. Men who died of cold in the Carpathian passes before a single skirmish had taken place. Tulabuga, advancing through the north via Transcarpathia, encountered the worst conditions. The snows of the Carpathians were ferocious that year, and his column, long and heavy and vulnerable, slowly came apart as it pushed deeper into the interior. Men and horses died of cold and exhaustion. Supplies ran short. But the Mongols kept advancing, because turning back before the weather was not something the horde could admit without losing something more than men. Meanwhile, inside Hungary, the barons and the frontier peoples were preparing with an efficiency that would have surprised any observer who expected the chaos that the king's political weakness seemed to promise. In Transylvania, Roland Borsa was organizing Saxons, Vlachs, and Szekely into local defense militias. He was not waiting for the king. He was not waiting for orders from anyone. He knew his land and he knew the enemy, and that was enough. The populations of villages along the eastern frontier packed what they could carry and fled westward toward the deeper valleys and the stone castles. Peasants who could not flee hid in the forests, in caves, in the corners that only they knew. Fortress garrisons inspected their walls, checked their reserves of water and food, sharpened their weapons, and waited. In the Carpathian passes, the Szekely distributed their warriors at key points, positions from which a handful of archers could control an entire gorge. Positions that only they knew how to find, and which to any outsider were simply part of the landscape. Nogai Khan crossed to the south, penetrating Transylvania with a column that advanced with relative speed compared to the difficulties Tulabuga faced in the north. His horsemen burned villages. They sacked the city of Regin, known then as Shasregan. They fell upon Brasov, the wealthy Saxon city known as Brasov. They pushed toward Bistrica, but every time they approached a stone fortress, they collided with walls that their winter rams could not bend. The castles that Ladislaus IV had ordered, built with such methodical obsession, held firm, and every hour Nogai's column spent before an impregnable wall was an hour in which supplies dwindled and the winter claimed more lives among their ranks. To the north, Tulabuga had managed to cross the Carpathians, but at a cost that no subsequent victory could have fully justified. His army arrived in the Hungarian interior, weakened, starving, and decimated by the snows. Even so, the Mongols ravaged what they could. They destroyed the fortified monastery of Sarivar. They pushed toward the center of the kingdom. And they reached Pest, the city east of the Danube that was, together with Buda on the opposite bank, the geographical heart of the Hungarian kingdom. But Pest was empty. The inhabitants had fled to the other side of the river, sheltering within the walls of Buda. What the Mongols found upon entering Pest was a city of silence and open doors. Streets where the wind scattered straw and ash, homes abandoned in haste, the coals still faintly warm beneath layers of cold. There was nothing worth looting, there was no one to subdue. And on the far side of the river, from the walls of Buda, the inhabitants watched in silence as the conquerors of the world walked among the ruins of a ghost city. It was at that moment, as Tulabuga's horsemen burned what little remained in Pest, that something unexpected occurred. Members of Queen Elizabeth's household guard launched a spirited and effective armed sally against the Mongols operating near the riverbank. a brief and bold attack that momentarily forced the invaders back while the Queen watched from the battlements above. It was not a decisive action on the military scale, but it was a sign. These Hungarians were not going to remain paralyzed, waiting to be crushed, and in that moment the army of Ladislaus IV was beginning to gather on the western bank of the Danube. The confrontation in the hills of western Transylvania was not a battle like the ones that the great epic chronicles describe. There was no single glorious day where two armies met on a pre-chosen field. It was something more complex, more cold, more pitiless than that. It was the collision of a new way of defending against a way of attacking that had worked for decades and that suddenly found all its advantages turned into traps. When Ladislaus IV finally managed to gather his forces and move eastward, Tulabuga had already spent weeks feeling the pressure closing in from every side. His supplies were at their limit. His men had fought for weeks with the cold, the hunger, and the Hungarian resistance as constant enemies. He had been unable to take any fortress of importance. Every stone castle he had encountered had held, and the time lost before those walls was time that the cold and hunger used to destroy his army from within. The Hungarian barons, Roland Borsa with his Transylvanian militias, the Szekely with their light cavalry mobility, constantly harassed the flanks and rear guard of the Mongol columns. Not in great direct engagements, but in the way the land itself fights against those who do not know it. Constant attrition, brief and lethal ambushes, unrelenting harassment that permits no rest by night or day, that turns every dawn into a provisional survival and every night into a new, invisible threat. The army of Ladislaus IV, when it finally made contact with Tulabuga's forces in the Transylvanian hills, was not the light and disordered army the Mongols had destroyed at Mohi 4 decades before. It was a different army. It had more heavy cavalry. It had knights in Western-style armor whose frontal charges were devastating on the irregular terrain of the hills, so different from the open plains where the light steppe cavalry held every advantage. The military reforms of Bela IV had changed the composition of the Hungarian army in ways that the horde spies, if there were any in that transformed interior, had not adequately conveyed. When the two forces clashed, the battle was short and brutal. Tulabuga's Mongols, exhausted, starving, and weakened by weeks of campaign in the worst winter in living memory, could not sustain combat against a force that arrived with greater energy and on terrain that favored their style of fighting. The impact of the Hungarian heavy cavalry against the Mongol lines had the effect of an avalanche upon loose snow. The formations gave way. The flanks buckled. Tulabuga, seeing that he could not hold his position without risking seeing his army completely encircled, gave the only order that a commander who has not lost all hope can give in that moment: retreat. But retreating to the horde meant crossing the Carpathians again, and the Szekely were waiting. What happened in the Carpathian passes during the weeks that followed Tulabuga's defeat is one of the darkest pages any army has lived in medieval European history. An army that had entered Hungary like a tempest was now a column of famished, disoriented, and terrified men attempting to cross mountains that winter had transformed into an inescapable trap. The Szekely were waiting for them at every pass. Not in open formations where the Mongols could maneuver, not in conventional battles where the discipline of the Tumans might make a difference, but from the ridge lines, from the rocks, from the pine forests that blanketed the slopes of the Carpathians. They were horse archers born in those heights who knew every path, every cave, every hollow where 100 men could vanish and reappear at will. They struck and disappeared, struck and disappeared. Arrows came from every direction, from above, from the flanks, sometimes from below, when the column crossed a narrow bridge or attempted to force a gorge. The Mongol horses, already weakened by weeks of hunger and cold, fell with arrows buried in their sides. The riders who lost them were left on foot on a mountain in winter, which was to say they were left condemned, and the hunger that the medieval chronicles describe with a rawness that makes the reader close their eyes. Tulabuga and his men, trapped between the snows of the Carpathians and the constant pressure of the Sekeli, began to slaughter and eat their own war horses, then their dogs. The same medieval chronicles, not usually given to dwelling on the most grim details of enemy defeats, mention with a disturbing coldness that when Tulabuga's forces finally crossed the border and reached friendly territory in the kingdom of Halych-Volhynia, they were so decimated and so desperate that they began sacking the cities and villages of their own allies. The army that had crossed the Carpathians as a conquering force returned as a horde of starving men who could no longer distinguish between enemy and vassal. To the south, the fate of Nogai Khan's column was different in its form, but not in its essence. Nogai was a more experienced commander than Tulabuga, and his advance through Transylvania had been more careful and methodical. He had looted what could be looted. He had avoided the grosser mistakes of his colleague. He had managed to destroy the Saxon castle of Ban Mikod in the Ariesh Valley, the only significant fortress to fall to the Mongols during the entire campaign. But he too had collided with the same reality that finished Tulabuga. The Hungarian stone castles did not fall. The Sekeli and the militias of Saxons and Vlachs, commanded by Roland Borsa, made it impossible for him to move freely, and his supplies also ran out at a speed that no prior planning had sufficiently anticipated. When Ladislaus IV, after defeating Tulabuga's forces, attempted to arrive in time to face Nogai as well, the old general had already made his decision. His forces had suffered serious defeats at the hands of local troops. The resistance of the Sekeli, the Saxons, and the Vlachs, directed by Roland Borsa, had been harder than any prior intelligence could have suggested. The Hungarian king was approaching with reinforcements from the west. Nogai ordered the retreat before spring. The king arrived too late to engage Nogai in open battle, but he joined the harassment of his withdrawal, pursuing the Mongols toward the frontier, launching skirmishes on their flanks, denying them even the final moment of rest before crossing the Carpathians. Nogai left Hungary with the more intact of the two invading columns, but also carrying a defeat that no number of looted villages could conceal. His column too was ambushed by the Sekeli in the passes on the way back. The losses were serious. When the spring of 1286 began to melt the snows of the Carpathians, the last forces of the Golden Horde abandoned Hungarian soil. The invasion had lasted approximately 2 months of active combat. It had begun with the full confidence of those who have never lost. It ended with armies that had eaten their own horses to avoid starving to death in the mountains. In the first weeks after the Horde's forces crossed back over the frontier, the Hungarian kingdom lived through something that does not fit easily into any of the usual words for describing a victory. There were no parades. There were no celebration ceremonies in the great city squares. There was, above all, silence. The silence of the burned villages on the eastern frontiers of Transylvania. The silence of the fields where the winter's dead waited for the thaw to uncover them from the slowly retreating snow. The silence of the fortresses that had held, their garrisons cautiously emerging from the walls to assess the damage that months of invasion pressure had left on the landscape surrounding their intact stone. Ladislaus IV returned westward with his army intact, but not in full triumph. He was a king whose victory had been achieved more by his barons than by himself. Roland Borsa, Amadeus Arba, George Baxa, Peter of Saros, the leaders of the Sekeli militias, the Saxon commanders who had defended their fortresses without waiting for a single royal order, they had won this war. The king had arrived when the decision was already made, when the Carpathians had already begun to devour the invaders. This truth, which everyone knew, though no one expressed it aloud, in the immediate weeks after the victory, would define Hungarian politics for the decades to come. Royal power would continue to erode. The barons who had saved the kingdom would consider themselves entitled to govern it. On the eastern steppes, Tulabuga returned to the horde, carrying the weight of a defeat that the history of the Tumans was not accustomed to bearing. His surviving soldiers told stories that their companions listened to in uncomfortable silence. Stories of castles that would not fall, of mountain passes where archers attacked from the fog and disappeared into the snow before anyone could respond. Of a hunger so profound that the warriors of the horde had eaten their own horses in the Carpathians. Stories that no one wanted to tell and that no one could stop hearing. In the forests of Transylvania, on the frozen slopes of the Carpathians, where the snow still held the traces of what had occurred, the Zekeli gathered their arrows from among the melting drifts. They returned to their villages, they returned to their homes, and they carved into their collective memory what they had done, a memory that their descendants would carry with them for generations. The second Mongol invasion of Hungary had consequences that stretched far beyond the kingdom's borders, and the years immediately following the winter of 1285. For Hungary, the victory confirmed what the reforms of Ladislaus IV had promised, but only the trial by fire could prove. A network of stone fortresses, combined with a decentralized defense deeply rooted in local knowledge of the terrain, could stop even the most feared army in the known world. The lesson did not go unnoticed in neighboring kingdoms. Less than 2 years later, when the horde attempted to invade Poland for the third time in 1287, the Poles applied a similar strategy, and the invasion was equally repelled, with the collaboration of Hungarian troops under the command of György of Sovar. For the Golden Horde, the defeat of 1285 marked the end of the great invasions into Central Europe. Never again would the horde launch a large-scale conquest campaign against Hungary. Frontier raids would continue for decades. Harassment, sacking of border villages, punitive incursions. But the ambition to conquer the kingdom, to complete what the first invasion had begun, to open the road toward Western Europe, lay buried in the Carpathian snows alongside the thousands of Tulabuga's soldiers who never returned to the steppes. For Tulabuga personally, the defeat had immediate and dramatic consequences. The shame of having lost an entire army in the Hungarian mountains was a wound to the horde's pride that did not heal easily. 1 year after the campaign, in 1287, Tulabuga used the accumulated resentment at court to orchestrate a coup and overthrow the weak Khan Tulabuga. He assumed power over the horde, but his reign was brief and turbulent, and ended when Nogai Khan, the man with whom he had shared command in Hungary, eliminated him and placed a new Khan on the throne. The defeat in the Hungarian snows had unleashed a spiral of internal violence within the horde that further weakened its capacity to project power westward. For Europe in general, the news of the Mongol defeat took time to be fully processed. The Mongols had been, since 1241, the embodiment of apocalyptic fear, the scourge of God, the storm that could not be stopped. But in 1285, a kingdom they had already defeated and devastated had turned them back. Not with the intervention of any Western power, not with a crusade organized from Rome, but with stone walls, mountain archers, militias of local barons, and the living memory of a defeat that a king and his people had decided would never be repeated. The Hungary that emerges from 1285 is a kingdom transformed by its own scars. The castles that Ladislaus IV had ordered, built in the decades of anguish that followed the first invasion, would stand for centuries. Some of those fortresses, such as Spiš Castle in what is today Slovakia, still rise above the hills of the region, monuments of stone that silently recall the price a people paid for the right to exist. And in the mountains of the Carpathians, in the passes where the Shekeli waited patiently for the most powerful army in the known world to attempt to cross back to its steppes, the wind still blows with the same force as in that winter of 1285. Only the wind and the silence of the rocks that saw everything, that kept everything, and that never forgot anything. Because there are defeats that kill armies, and there are victories that save civilizations. The one that took place in those frozen passes, the one that no chronicler celebrated with the grandeur it deserved, was both at once. And the echo of that resistance resonated for centuries in the heart of Central Europe, in the stone of the castles that held, in the memory of the peoples who did not yield, in the extraordinary silence of a winter that swallowed the invincible.